All right, good evening and welcome to our virtual budget community meeting on FY 2024's Chesterfield County's proposed operating and capital budgets. My name is Gerard Durkin and I am Chesterfield County's Budget Director. I will be walking through both the operating and capital plans this evening and then with a question and answer session at the end. So we have quite a few slides to get through, so let's start rolling. So the first slide you see is this time of year is usually the busiest for us and it's probably the most publicised. But two main things from this chart that I hope that people take away is that, this budget is a year-round process. You can see on there there's about 20 plus boxes of various moving parts that go into building this budget between us as a county, the school board and the state. One of the things I will say is that it's kind of unfortunate the timing with all three of these situations together, and that the school board has to go first with early state revenue estimates and then coming to us with the superintendent's proposed budget due to the county administrator by March 1. We take it from there to have the proposed budget that is before the Board of Supervisors and that we're talking about this evening. But the real wild card in this, and it's been happening for a few years now and it's happening again this year, is our friends at the state. At this point, they have not passed a budget. We do not know when that will happen. And that is actually really impacting what we can do both for us on the county side and on the school side. We are hopeful that in the next few weeks that the state will actually pass its budget. But until then, we kind of remain in limbo. And there's really particular emphasis on the school side where that's happening, as I'll talk through as we go through the rest of this presentation. So the chart you see before you is the proposed budget for all funds. Most emphasis traditionally has been on the general fund for the county and the school operating fund for the school side. But Chesterfield as a whole, as one organisation, is actually a $1.9 billion budget. For FY 2024, that is an increase of about 167 million, or just a little under 9.5%. As you can see there, by far the largest component of this budget is the schools at 50.4%, or in dollar terms, 977.1 million. The next orange blocks have been split in half. That is the general fund exclusive of what we transfer to schools. Two things I will point out here: public safety, primarily police, fire and sheriff, take up about $240.9 million of the budget, or about 12.8%. With the other general fund departments, about over 30 in total, from parks, libraries, social services, accounting for about 330 million. The other big block that you can see on there is utilities. Those are not derived from taxes, but on user fees for water and wastewater services. So in total, the general fund, exclusive of that transfer to schools, is about $571 million, as opposed to the school operating fund of 977. So again, schools, the largest component of the overall budget for the organisation. Now, before moving into the nuts and bolts of the operating budget, there are a couple of things that I would like to talk about in terms of school expenditures. And this chart has been going around for a while as part of the superintendent's budget. But there are a couple of things that I would like to point out in this chart. First of all, you can see on the left of the chart, we have a lot of Northern Virginia localities within this chart. That drags up the average spending per pupil. It doesn't matter if it's on schools, if it's in general fund, if it's on cost of living, if it's in the private sector. Northern Virginia, just by virtue of its size and cost of living, will drag any average at any table that you look up if you include us as a region in there. So it disproportionately increases that level. For example, teacher salaries in Northern Virginia are in the 70 to 80,000 range. Down in this area it is a lot lower, it's in the 50,000 range. To get to that equivalency, you would actually need to raise our real estate rate by 20 cents just to match that. Again, it's just, no matter what metric you look at, school spending, government spending, private sector spending, you have to take into regional disparities. Second, the chart is actually from 2021. We are now going into the fiscal year 2024 budget. That is a 3-year time lag. That is the latest data out there if you want to go and look at the Virginia Department of Education's Superintendent Reports website. 2022 report is being compiled, but it is not available yet. So what this doesn't really take into effect is that the school budget since 2021 to what is being proposed now is actually grown $207 million, or 27%. That is a large number that is not factoring into that average per pupil spending. And then the third thing that I'd like to point out is that the chart from before, this one here, is focusing on the per pupil for regular day spending. But just like everything else, be it in your personal expenditures, there are other expenditures beyond day-to-day that you have to factor into your budgets that will impact your spending. And it is no different on the school side. On the same report, which is table 13, I encourage people to go out there and look at it. Once you factor in those other expenditures, primarily debt service, we've made a heavy investment in our facilities for both the county and schools. We pay debt service on that, just like teacher salaries. That ought to factor in to the average per pupil spending. Once you take those into account, you see that $10,902 average spend for us actually jumps up to about $14,441 per pupil. Once you remove, again, those Northern Virginia localities, you can see that we are actually really in the middle of the pack compared to our regional peers. And there's been a statistic that's been floating around that, you know, looking at that previous chart, Chesterfield ranks 130th out of 132 in terms of per pupil spending. But once you factor in the holistic picture, the regular spending and then the operations and maintenance spending, we're actually in the middle of the pack. We actually ranked 63rd when you look at that data, and we look forward to seeing what the future year reports will show as and when they are available. To that end, our budget, the largest line that you will see in the general fund budget is the transfer to schools. It is $383.4 million. But just like I said earlier with the conversation, the investment in schools is a year-round process, and over the last few years, this board has made some unprecedented investments in education. These are the four main ones that you see before you. In 2021, the county was able, due to virtue of its conservative budgeting practices, to be able to go to the market to borrow $58 million to invest in major maintenance. There was a lot of major maintenance issues in the schools over the last few years. This board took the decision to go to market and actually make the largest investment in major maintenance in our school system in its history at $58 million. Last November, voters approved by a wide margin the 2022 referendum. It was a $540 million referendum, with 375 of that going towards 7 school projects. Over the last few years as well on the county side, the labour market has been a top priority for this board as well as the school board, and thanks to the record investment and the increase in transfer to schools, $79 million has been realised in school compensation. That is the largest investment in school compensation in schools history. And then, as I'll go through in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides, the recurring transfer has really jumped up and more than doubled over this board's tenure, this year hitting $20 million. There's quite a lot of information on this slide. Again, it's a year-round process. I will not go through everything, but the support for schools does go beyond that one line item transfer. I will point out a couple of them on here. The contribution to the school supplemental retirement program. That program was severely underfunded just 6 years ago. It was about 16.67% funded. The markets typically like those plans to be funded at 80% and above. So as you can see, just on a pure arithmetic basis, there was a large gap in that funding. Due to the surpluses that the county had ran over the last couple of years, we worked with the actuaries and the board elected to make a one-time investment into the school's retirement plan of $27 million, an unprecedented amount which was able to shore up the investment in that plan to then free up recurring dollars that could be used for other operational needs for schools. And then another one I'll point out is the federal pandemic relief allocations. A lot of federal monies flowed down from the county and schools from the federal government over the last 2 years. Schools received their own funds as well as the county. The board elected to divert $53 million of its own allocation to the schools on top of what the schools received. So again, unprecedented amounts that's been invested in the school system over the last 3 years. So the chart you see before you is the recurring increased transfer to schools. As I say, in fiscal year 24, it is proposed to be $383.4 million. That is an increase of $20 million over last year's budget. The chart really shows the comparison of what's happened over the last few years. from fiscal year 2017 through fiscal year 2020, the average increase in the transfer was about $8.4 million. In fiscal year 21, when we had the COVID recession, the board maintained an increase in schools funding of about $8.5 million. That was on the flip side of the county actually cutting its own budget by $50 million, so essentially holding the schools harmless and increasing that transfer during that recessionary period. And then in the last 3 years, there's been a nice step up of $18 million to 19 to 20. And I will point out that in fiscal year 23, that $27 million investment in the schools retirement plan actually freed up expenditure capacity on the school side of about $10.9 million. That does not show up on the transfer. It does not show up as a transfer from the county of that increase in $10.9 million. But what it does do on the school side of the ledger actually frees up capacity for them to divert to other operational needs. So where are we right now in terms of the school's funding gap? Well, when the superintendent originally proposed his budget, it stood at $16 million based on the information that we knew at the time. Working with our school friends and looking at our own resources and what we could afford to do, the county was able to come up with an additional $3 million to increase the planned transfer of $17 million to 20. We did that through a variety of means, but one of them was kind of doing a two-tier implementation of additional funding stuff for the county. We then worked with our school friends to look at their budget and recognise that there was some one-time operating costs in their budget. We as an organisation said, we have helped you in the past, this is a one-time cost that we will be able to pick up moving forward. And so we've been able to invest an additional $5 million in that as well. So right now, that $16 million gap is actually $8 million. We are hopeful at this juncture that the state will come through with the additional $8 million. But as I say, the county has stepped up and covered half of the gap. Both the Board of Supervisors and the school board have sent letters to their state delegation encouraging them to basically meet us in the middle. We have put down 50% of the gap. We are asking and encouraging the state to meet us to close the remaining 50% gap. So one of the things over the last few years is the effects of inflation and real estate values and personal property values have affected everyone, not just in this county, but around the country. And the board, recognising the impacts of these on our citizens, have enacted basically the largest tax relief programme in the county's history. You can see all of the major tax relief categories that the board has enacted over the last 3 years. Most of them are recurring in nature with some one-time investments in there too, but it's really been targeted across all sectors in the community, from our businesses to our homeowners to personal property owners, as well as our elderly and senior citizens in the community. I'll touch on a couple of these. Real estate. Last year the board cut the real estate rate from 95 cents to 92 cents. In the proposed budget that is before them today, it is being recommended to reduce that again by an additional 1 cent. Every 1 cent of relief approximately equals about $5 million in relief. And then the vehicle registration fee, last year's budget was cut from 40 to 20. That will remain at 20. All of those funds go entirely to transportation projects in our capital improvement programme. That provides annual relief of about $8 million to vehicle owners within the community. So in total, annual recurring tax relief is about $38.6 million per year, thanks to the actions that this board has taken over the last 4 years. Unsurprisingly, the labour market across all sectors, public, private and non-profit, has been extremely tight in the last few years. It has been extremely competitive. Those that we have traditionally competed with, we are now also competing with those who we have not traditionally competed with. To that end, to retain the best and brightest in the workforce, this board has made unprecedented investments in the workforce, specifically in 3 areas. One, in public safety. They have implemented a step plan over the last 3 years that has cost about $26.3 million. For the general government, there's been targeted wage increases from hard-to-fill positions, from custodians to accountants. Last year, that was a $15 million investment in the workforce. And in fiscal year 24, recognising we couldn't do everything in 1 year, this year does include additional enhancements in compensation. The general government pay plan has 2 phases. The second phase investment is about $7.9 million. And then the public safety pay enhancements, in order to keep up with the regional peers, are going to increase the starting salaries by about 10%, which will be an additional $9.2 million investment in our public safety workforce. So really quickly, you can see two charts on the table here. One is the regional teacher salary. You can see over the 30-year career of a teacher, it actually pays to stay here in Chesterfield. They will earn the most compared to our regional peers in Hanover and Henrico. And right now, the same with police officers, from recruits all the way through up the senior ranks. We are now the leader in public safety pay as well. So once you've made all those investments in education, in tax relief, and in the workforce, what's left for additional services? Well, in short, there was about 0.4% left. That equates to about $4 million. And so we approached this in a kind of pragmatic, sustainable fashion, recognizing that our schools needed additional funds. We decided to split these additional investments into two waves. The first wave costing $1.5 million, effective July 1, with the second wave of investments coming in on January 1st, 2024. Right now, unsurprisingly, you've seen in the headlines, there's kind of some conflicting economic data out there. That, coupled with transferring more to our schools, meant that we took a kind of pragmatic, sustainable approach to investments over the next 5-year horizon. So what are some of the highlights of those investments? The first one is that we are going to be merging our constituent services and communications and media departments into one constituent and media services department. There's been diminishing local news coverage over the last couple of years, and so to promote transparency and direct outreach and engagement, we have put in this budget this proposal to merge two departments. On top of that, it does include additional funding and resources for a web quality assurance analyst to make sure that the website remains up to date and is laid out for citizens so they can easily navigate the government website to see what is going on in the local government, be it the budget or planning, etc. Secondly, there's a photographer, and then lastly, a digital content creator, assisting with creating content for the county's social media platforms, as well as the podcasts, websites, and digital campaigns, all to promote transparency and direct outreach with the community, especially as an example, like events like tonight and the other community meetings we've had on this budget throughout this process. The county has stepped back with the CVWMA contract. It does recognise the potential burdens that that could have on the citizens. To that end, we are expanding our recycling efforts across the community. We are going to be returning to 7-day operations at both convenience centres in the community. There will be funding to improve access and streamlining to recycling areas within those convenience centres. And around our park system, we will be expanding free drop-off recycling to designated county parks. There'll be free seasonal residential leaf disposal. And we are exploring other opportunities for grant funding to be able to fund this at little to no cost to the community if we can receive such funding. For public safety, in addition to the investments in compensation, there are two main things I would draw people's attention to here. We are going to be fully staffing the fire and EMS department by adding 36 positions to address minimum staffing. They have worked a lot of overtime. In cases it has been mandatory overtime. That creates burnout issues and morale issues. This budget goes ahead and adds 36 positions to the fire department to bring them up to that minimum staffing level that will allow them to maintain the world-class services that they provide. Secondly, the Police Real-Time Crime Centre. With the federal funding that we received 2 years ago, we actually capitalised and set up, and stood up, I should say, a real-time crime centre to allow the police department to focus on real-time incidents that were happening in the community. Recognising that the federal funding was one-time in nature, we knew that we'd have to pick up the costs of running that centre. Fiscal year 2024's budget does do that for $300,000, primarily for subscription to data analytics programs. So that's the highlights of the operating budget. Now moving on to the capital improvement plan spanning fiscal years 24 through 28. Similar to the all expenditures chart that we went through on the operating side, this is the expense summary for the general government CIP. I will draw your attention to the orange box, the olive box, Transportation covers both of those. POWHITE extension is the largest component of that transportation investment in the CIP. For context, the board's investment in transportation projects has actually tripled since fiscal year 2020. And if you go to our budget document, you will see each year a list of unfunded transportation projects. That list is now well over $4 billion. So there's been a heavy emphasis on transportation investment as part of the CIP. We are going ahead with referendum projects starting this year and continuing through fiscal year 24 and beyond. I will go through what those particular projects are in a few slides, but by the end of this horizon, this 5-year plan, by 2028, 14 of the 16 projects will either be initiated or completed, with 90% of that funding being utilised to develop the facilities. So the referendum that was passed in November was passed with an historic 76%. We are planning to go to the market to issue the first set of bonds this May. When we presented this plan last year, the referendum spanned 5 years. It now spans 7, recognising that there's continued cost pressures out there, as well as just being able to spread these projects out more efficiently over a wider horizon. So in fiscal year 2023's budget, not the one that we're proposing, but the year that we're currently in, there is a blend of parks and recreation and public safety projects, investments at River City, as well as replacing Chester Fire Station and building a brand new Stonebridge area police station at Midlothian Turnpike. So here's kind of a nice visual of the referendum timeline. You can see there's a nice cadence between public safety and parks and libraries over the next 7-year horizon, finishing out by 2029 with the Dutch Gap Fire Station and James River Police Station. The one question that we got asked throughout this process when we were talking about the referendum was, how are we going to fund it? This is the chart you see before you with the debt service. This is just for the county. As you can see, it is being financed at a sustainable level. There are no new taxes associated with this. We can pay for these costs with our existing resources. The debt service, the way we have structured it, is aggressively paid off year after year, as you can see on the chart. The general fund will tighten up over the next 6 to 7 years, but then as those prior year bonds begin to get paid off, that frees up capacity, which then would allow us to go back out for the next set of referendum projects in the next 7 to 10 years. Another thing that we hear a lot is, there's a lot of development in the county. Does the investment in the capital plan and infrastructure keep up with that? And the short answer is yes. We went back and looked at certificates of occupancy that have been issued all the way back to 1975. The average per year is about 2,500. You can see that in certain parts of the 70s, 80s, and the early 2000s, there have been spikes in those certificates of occupancy. It has risen in the last few years, but as you can see with the latest data that we have at 2022, it is pretty much bang on the long run average over the last 40 or so years. So back to a more sustainable level that we are confident with the investment in the capital programme will be able to keep up with the increased population growth in the community. So to that end, we utilise an in-house programme called Stratus. It's a very data-driven programme, and it looks at a variety of metrics to see where is the best place to put these projects, where is essentially the best bang for the buck for this investment. So we looked at where these certificate of occupancies were issued. You can see the heat map on the chart before you. Unsurprisingly, most of that has been occurring out in the Western Hull Street area. But as you can see with the dots on there with the police, fire, parks, schools and libraries, a lot of them have been centred around where most of those certificates have been issued. And it's a nice balanced spread across the community. It's not concentrated in one particular area, but the investments are being made where the infrastructure is being built out, which will allow us to meet not only the needs of people that are living there today, but of the needs of the citizens coming tomorrow as well. As I said earlier, the CIP has a historic investment in transportation. For context, the fiscal year 2020 plan, the investment in transportation was $114 million. This proposed capital plan actually triples that to $356.9 million. There's been a variety of new revenue sources that have been able to aid in this investment. As I said earlier, the transfer of the vehicle registration fee solely towards transportation projects is one. Another large one is the Central Virginia Transportation Authority, a regional tax on sales and use tax as well as wholesale fuels, which has allowed us to really jumpstart a lot of our investments in our transportation projects. But I do want to draw attention to one particular transportation project that is in this capital improvement plan, and that's the POWHITE Parkway. For some kind of background information, this has been on the planning books since 1989. It was on there as a dotted line, and this plan is actually the first concrete step to making this a reality. The envisioned plan is to take it from where it currently is terminating at Charter Colony, eventually all the way through to Hull Street, recognising that we cannot absorb that entire cost alone. The two phases would be north of $700 million. Working with our transportation department, it's been split into essentially two phases. Phase one is a 2.25 mile extension from Woolridge up to Woolridge Road, and then with the second phase going from there all the way through to Hull Street. But this plan is the first plan in the county's history where we are using all of our local resources to fund that first phase extension with no new tolls. We had sought federal funding. The federal government saw fit not to do that investment. However, going back to the drawing board and using our creativity, we are able to fully fund this plan. The first phase costs $170 million. The funding sources though are a kind of blend. There's the CVTMA component, the $78.5 million. There is a special assessment district up there. It's about 5 cents and additional real estate taxes that are meant to be used for transportation projects. And then finally, as I said earlier, with that way we aggressively pay off our debt, there will be future capacities to be able to invest in such a large project as this. So the plan would be in fiscal year 24 to work on the preliminary engineering and design, fiscal year 25 to close out any remaining right-of-way acquisitions, with fiscal years 26 through 28 being the construction of this first phase. But recognising the importance of the whole project, especially as it relates to the development of the Upper Magnolia site and in terms of business investment, the county's already went ahead and invested $8 million in the second phase of this project. The total phase of that is approximately going to be about just over $400 million. But hopefully with this investment, we are showing our state and federal partners, as well as potential business investments, that we are open for business and that we are encouraging investment and infrastructure improvement in our community. So much is said about unfunded or gaps in funding with the school's budget. It is no different on our side, both on the operating and the capital improvement program. Just for some context, there was $14.6 million worth of requests covering 45 positions across all general government agencies that we could not fund. We cannot do everything in one go. That applies both to schools and us as well. That has required some tough discussions, as well as looking to see if there's other ways of being able to phase this in over a multi-year process, much like we did with compensation as one example. If we can't do it in 1 year, we look at other ways of being able to do it. All of these requests are necessary for the community, but just given the resources that we have, we're trying to do it in a sustainable, conservative manner. And then on the CIP, I've already referenced the unfunded transportation list, but other projects, the unfunded amount for those was about $851 million. So after this evening's Facebook meeting, we have 2 more in-person community meetings, one on March 20th at the Dale District at Meadowbrook High School, March 21st at the Matoaka District at the new Matoaka Elementary School, with the budget public hearing on March 22nd, and then April 5th with the actual final budget adoption. However, if the state doesn't come through, we will have to come back and amend that if there are significant changes prior to the official adoption of the budget being enacted on July 1. So with that, I thank you for listening to the presentation, and we have some staff here and we're happy to take some questions. Okay, so the first question is, can we provide more information on the real estate tax relief rebate and when will that happen? Well, I'll answer the second part of that question first. It will happen on your upcoming June 5th bill. Recognising the inflated values of both housing and personal property last year, when we closed out our fiscal year 2022 results, the board directed us to set up a reserve for tax relief of about $10 million. They charge us throughout the year, just like everything else with schools. It's a year-round process. Other ways that we can provide tax relief, either one-time or recurring in nature, that's sustainable. This was one avenue that we could. We have been working with our real estate assessor's office as well as our treasurer's office to make this happen. Working with both of them on the upcoming June 5th bill cycle, you will see on your real estate bill a 5% credit on your real estate bill amount. Second question we have is, how is the county taking into account high car values? Well, last year, the county as well as our regional friends as well as nationwide saw a huge spike in assessed values. Last year, the Board of Supervisors actually provided $23 million of extra relief on personal property values. Not to get into the nuts and bolts of it, but every year the state allocates localities money for tax relief for personal property. The downside of that programme is that it has been set at the same level since the late 1990s. Chesterfield receives about $41 million from the state on that. Recognising those high values, we went ahead and increased the relief percent based on that $41 million from about 46% to 55%. That generated about $23 million additional relief to citizens. That's not something the state paid, that is something that the Board of Supervisors elected to do. In this year's budget cycle, just for some context, personal property values have came down. In the county, they are down about 20%. Working again with the Commissioner of Revenue and Treasurer, the Board, as part of this proposed budget, is going further than the $41 million of relief. They're actually going to add an additional $15 million worth of relief on top of that 51, recognising that car values are not exactly back to where they are. They still remain slightly elevated. But for some context, the assessed value of all the personal property in the county fell by $1 billion over the last year. So essentially a drop of about a fifth, right in line with where we're seeing vehicle assessed values. All right, well, seeing no more questions, feel free to contact the Budget Department throughout this process. As I say, we still have more community meetings next Monday and Tuesday, with the public hearing next Wednesday. And as ever, if you wish to email your inquiries or questions, please feel free to do so at blueprint@chesterfield.gov. And I wish you all a good evening.